October 14th, 1943. 30,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. Staff Sergeant Robert Johnson pressed his face against the cold plexiglass of his waist-gun position aboard the B-17 F, Ruthie II. Through the frozen condensation on the window, he could see them coming, dark specks materializing out of the eastern sun, growing larger with terrifying speed. Focke-Wulf, Fw-190s. At least a dozen of them, arranged in a hunting formation that German pilots called the company front. They were diving from altitude, building speed to over 400 miles per hour, preparing to tear through the American bomber formation like wolves through a flock of sheep. Johnson had been flying missions over Germany for 3 months. He'd fired thousands of rounds from his Browning M2, 50 caliber machine gun. He'd tracked dozens of German fighters through his sight. He'd watched tracers arc out toward attacking aircraft, seemingly on target, yet rarely saw results. The frustration gnawed at him constantly. He wasn't alone. Across the 8th Air Force bomber formations, struggling through German skies in autumn 1943, thousands of gunners shared the same maddening experience. They aimed carefully. They led the target just as training had taught them. They fired disciplined bursts to conserve ammunition, yet German fighters continued pressing attacks, often escaping without visible damage. The numbers told a grim story. Analysis of gun camera footage and combat reports from August through October 1943 revealed that B-17 and B-24 gunners were achieving confirmed kills on only 8% of German fighters they engaged. 8%. That meant 92 out of every 100 German fighters that attacked American bomber formations escaped to attack again. The implications were devastating. The combined bomber offensive, the strategic air campaign against Nazi Germany, depended on heavy bombers reaching their targets despite fighter opposition. If bomber defensive firepower couldn't deter or destroy attacking fighters, losses would become unsustainable. The numbers proved this wasn't theoretical concern. During the first Schweinfurt raid on August 17, 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 36 bombers out of 230, dispatched a loss rate of 15.6%. On October 14th, the second Schweinfurt mission, losses reached 77 bombers from 291, dispatched 26.5% losses in a single day. At such rates, bomber crews had almost no statistical chance of surviving a 25-mission tour. Something was fundamentally wrong with American bomber gunnery doctrine, and men were dying because of it. The problem had been identified months earlier, but understanding the cause proved difficult. Captain Harold Bowman, an armament officer with the 91st Bomb Group based at Bassingbourn, had been collecting data systematically since June 1943. He interviewed returning gunners after every mission, documenting what they'd observed during combat. Bowman noticed patterns. Experienced gunners reported that their aim seemed accurate. They could see their tracers arcing toward attacking fighters. Yet the fighters rarely showed damage. New gunners did no worse than veterans, suggesting experience wasn't the primary factor. All gunners, regardless of skill level, were missing by similar margins. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The German pilots noticed too. Luftwaffe after-action reports from autumn 1943 described American bomber defensive fire as impressive in volume but generally inaccurate. German fighter pilots learned to press attacks closer than they'd initially dared, recognizing that the odds of actually being hit remained surprisingly low despite the tremendous firepower directed at them. Fw-190 pilots developed tactics exploiting this inaccuracy. They'd approach from the bomber's 6 o'clock position directly astern where the B-17's tailguns provided the only defense. The Fw-190s heavy nose armament of two 13mm machine guns and two 20mm cannon could devastate a bomber's tail section from 300 yards. The attacking fighter would close rapidly, fire a concentrated burst into the bomber's tail, then break away violently before the bomber's formation mates could bring defensive fire to bear. The entire attack lasted perhaps 4 or 5 seconds. American tail gunners had that brief window to score a hit. They almost never did. The tail gunner would track the approaching fighter, center it in his optical sight, and fire. He'd see his tracers streaming toward the target. Then the Fw-190 would flash past, usually unscathed, while his bomber shuddered from cannon strikes. At Bowman's urging, the 91st Bomb Group began mounting gun cameras on defensive positions during October missions. The resulting footage provided the first objective data on why American gunners were missing. The films showed something that hadn't been apparent to the gunners themselves. When a gunner centered an attacking fighter in his sight and fired, the tracers appeared to arc directly toward the target for the first 100 yards. Then they began curving behind the fighter's flight path. By the time the bullets reached the fighter's altitude, they were passing through empty air the fighter had occupied a fraction of a second earlier. The gunners were aiming directly at where the fighter was, not where it would be when the bullets arrived. In aerial gunnery terminology, they weren't providing sufficient lead or deflection, the angular offset needed to compensate for the target's motion across the gunner's line of sight. This shouldn't have been happening. American gunners trained extensively in deflection shooting before deploying overseas. At gunnery schools in Nevada and Florida, they'd practiced tracking targets from moving platforms, learning to lead their aim to compensate for relative motion between gunner and target. But the training used relatively slow-moving targets, towed sleeves pulled by aircraft at perhaps 200 miles per hour, targets on ground ranges that moved at predictable speeds. Nothing in the training prepared gunners for fighters attacking at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. The physics were unforgiving. A 50 caliber bullet leaves the muzzle at approximately 2,900 feet per second. That sounds impressively fast until you calculate how long it takes to travel 300 yards, the typical range for effective bomber defensive fire. At 900 feet, the bullet requires approximately 0.31 seconds to reach the target. An Fw-190 attacking at 400 miles per hour travels 586 feet per second. In the 0.31 seconds the bullet flies, the fighter moves 182 feet 60 yards. If the gunner aims directly at the fighter, the bullets pass through empty space, nearly a football field behind where the fighter has flown. The required lead angle depended on multiple factors simultaneously. The fighter's speed and direction, the bomber's speed and direction, whether the fighter was approaching from ahead, behind, or the side, whether it was climbing, diving, or in level flight. The range to target, even atmospheric conditions affecting bullet trajectory. Computing the correct deflection required solving differential equations in real time while being shot at, freezing temperatures, and dealing with the physical stress of high-altitude flight. American gunnery training had taught simplified rules for deflection shooting, but those rules assumed much slower target speeds than German fighters actually achieved. The October gun camera footage made the problem undeniable. Something had to change, and change quickly, or the strategic bombing campaign would fail from unsustainable losses. The 8th Air Force temporarily suspended deep penetration missions into Germany after the October 14th Schweinfurt disaster. Until long-range fighter escorts became available, bombers wouldn't venture beyond the range of friendly fighter cover. This provided a critical window for addressing the gunnery crisis. In November 1943, the 8th Air Force established a special gunnery training detachment at Duxford airfield under Captain Bowman's direction. Their mission: determine why trained gunners were missing and develop methods to fix it. Bowman assembled a team that included experienced combat gunners, armament specialists, and a civilian mathematician named Dr. Philip Morse from MIT, who'd been assigned to operational research duties with the 8th Air Force. Morse brought scientific methodology to analyzing combat effectiveness. They began by precisely measuring what German fighters actually did during attacks. Combat footage was analyzed frame by frame, approach angles were measured, attack speeds were calculated. Breakaway maneuvers were documented. The data began revealing patterns in German fighter tactics. Most devastating were the high-speed passes from Austern directly behind the bomber formation. These attacks accounted for over 60% of all approaches. The Fw-190, with its excellent high-altitude performance and heavy armament, proved particularly effective in this attack profile. The team calculated actual closing speeds during these attacks. German pilots typically dove from several thousand feet above the bomber formation, building speed to 400 to 450 miles per hour before leveling off 500 yards behind their target. They'd close that distance in approximately 4 seconds while firing continuously. At 300 yards, the range where 50 caliber fire became most effective, the required deflection angle was astronomical. If the fighter approached from directly astern at 400 miles per hour, while the bomber flew at 180 miles per hour, the closing speed was 220 miles per hour, or 322 feet per second. With bullet flight time of 0.31 seconds at 300 yards, the fighter would travel approximately 100 feet during bullet flight. But the fighter wasn't simply moving in a straight line relative to the bomber, it was approaching along a converging path. The geometric calculation proved complex. Dr. Morse developed a simplified computational method. For a fighter attacking from astern at high speed, the required lead angle at 300 yards worked out to approximately 30 to 50 mils, a mil being a unit of angular measurement, where 1 mil equals approximately 3.4 feet at 1,000 yards distance. Translating that into practical terms for gunners, you had to aim at empty sky approximately 15 to 25 feet behind where the fighter appeared to be. Your natural instinct screamed that this was wrong. Your training taught you to aim slightly ahead of the target. Now analysis suggested you needed to aim dramatically behind it. This seemed to violate everything gunners knew about deflection shooting. But the mathematics were undeniable, and the gun camera footage confirmed it. Gunners who aimed directly at attacking fighters, or slightly ahead of them, consistently missed behind the target's flight path. The explanation lay in understanding relative motion. When ground-based gunners shoot at aircraft, they lead the target aiming ahead of it because the target moves across a stationary reference frame. But bomber gunners weren't stationary. They were moving through the air at 180 miles per hour in the same direction as their bomber. When an Fw-190 attacked from astern, it was overtaking the bomber. From the gunner's perspective inside the moving bomber, the fighter appeared to be approaching relatively slowly, only the 220 mile per hour closure rate, not its actual 400 mile per hour speed through the air. But the bullets, once fired, were no longer moving with the bomber. They inherited the bomber's 180 mile per hour forward velocity at the instant of firing, then continued on that trajectory while being affected by their own muzzle velocity and atmospheric drag. The fighter, meanwhile, continued at its full 400 mile per hour speed. The bullet's path and the fighter's path were now in a complex geometric relationship, where both the bullet and target were moving at different speeds through three-dimensional space. The solution wasn't intuitive because it contradicted the gunner's frame of reference. The required lead was actually a negative number you had to aim behind the target as it appeared to you, even though the target was approaching rather than moving across your field of fire. Your tracer rounds would curve forward relative to your moving frame of reference, reaching the point in space where the fighter would be when bullets and fighter met. Understanding this concept intellectually was one thing. Training gunners to actually do it under combat conditions would prove entirely different. Everything about the technique contradicted training and instinct. But without solving this problem, the bomber offensive against Germany couldn't continue. Captain Bowman and his team faced a challenge. How do you train men to ignore their instincts and aim at empty sky behind a fighter that's shooting at them? December 1943. Duxford Airfield, England. Technical Sergeant William Thompson stood in the modified tailgun position of a B-17F, his hands gripping the controls of the Browning M2, 50 caliber machine gun. Outside the aircraft, a converted Spitfire approached from behind at high speed, simulating a Luftwaffe fighter attack. Thompson was a veteran of 23 combat missions. He'd shot at more German fighters than he could count. By his own estimate, he'd fired over 10,000 rounds in combat. He'd never scored a confirmed kill. Now, Captain Bowman stood behind him in the cramped tail position, shouting over the wind noise, "Remember, track him, but stay behind his tail. Don't chase him with your sight. Let him fly into your stream." Thompson watched the Spitfire grow larger in his optical sight. Every instinct screamed to center the attacking aircraft in his reticle and fire. That's what training had taught him. That's what 3 months of combat had reinforced. Instead, he forced himself to hold his aim point approximately 20 feet behind the Spitfire's tail section. The Spitfire's mock attack run brought it to 300 yards, then 200 yards. Thompson pressed the firing button. The gun camera mounted beside his weapon began recording. Chalk rounds, special training ammunition that left visible marks streamed from his weapon. Thompson released the firing button and watched as the fighter broke away to the right. He had no idea whether he'd hit the target. At 300 miles per hour closing speed, the entire engagement had lasted less than 5 seconds. After the Spitfire landed, ground crews examined the aircraft. 16 chalk marks showed on the fuselage and wings. Thompson had scored what would have been lethal hits with his very first practice run using the new aiming technique. In 23 actual combat missions, he'd never come close to this result. This training detachment at Duxford represented the 8th Air Force's response to the gunnery crisis. After analysing gun camera footage and computing the required deflection angles for high-speed stern attacks, the obvious question was, could gunners actually be trained to aim that far behind an attacking fighter? The initial response from most experienced gunners was negative. Master Sergeant Frank Perez, a tail gunner with 16 missions over Germany, expressed the common objection, "Sir, if I aim that far behind him, I'll be shooting at air. My bullets can't curve forward to catch him. Basic physics says it won't work." Perez wasn't wrong about the physics. Bullets don't curve forward in space. But what he hadn't grasped, what none of the gunners had initially understood, was that the frame of reference mattered crucially. From the ground, a bullet's path would indeed appear to curve behind a high-speed target, but from inside a bomber, moving at 180 miles per hour, the relative motion created different geometry. Dr. Morse developed a demonstration to help gunners understand the principle. He had ground crews mount a camera on a fixed tripod outside a B-17, aimed at the bomber's tail gun position. Then he had the bomber taxi past at 20 miles per hour, while a tail gunner tracked a stationary target beside the runway, firing chalk rounds. The tail gunner, tracking the target from his moving platform, naturally aimed directly at the stationary object. But the camera on the fixed tripod, representing a stationary ground observer, recorded something different. The bullets appeared to curve forward from the bomber, even though the gunner aimed straight at the target. The demonstration revealed the core principle. Inside the moving bomber, the gunner's frame of reference made straight-line aiming feel correct. But the bullets, once fired, travelled through space in a path determined by the bomber's forward velocity plus the bullet's muzzle velocity. From any other frame of reference, this created apparent curvature. When attacking, fighters approached from astern at high speed. They were effectively stationary relative to the ground, or actually moving slower than the bomber, if you considered their forward velocity component. The gunner needed to compensate for his own forward motion by aiming behind where the fighter appeared to be. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Understanding the theory helped, but actually executing the technique required extensive training. Captain Bowman's team developed a progressive training program that started with basic principles and built toward realistic combat simulations. Step 1 involved classroom instruction using detailed diagrams, showing bullet trajectories from both ground and airborne reference frames. Gunners worked through simplified mathematical examples, calculating required lead angles for various attack scenarios. The goal wasn't making gunners into mathematicians, but helping them understand why the technique worked. Step 2. Move to ground-based simulation. The training team modified several B-17 seconds by cutting openings in the fuselage and mounting gun positions on pivoting bases that could simulate the movement of a bomber in flight. Gunners practiced tracking targets while ground crews rotated the aircraft's orientation, creating the sensation of motion without actually flying. Fighter aircraft flew past at measured distances and speeds. Gunners tracked them using the new aiming technique, with gun cameras recording their aim points. After each run, instructors analyzed the footage, showing gunners exactly where their aim had been relative to where it needed to be. The training revealed individual variation in how much compensation different gunners needed. Some naturally tracked smoothly, requiring minimal correction. Others had jerky tracking movements that required conscious smoothing. Bowman's instructors developed personalized coaching based on each gunner's specific tendencies. Step 3. Incorporated actual flight training. Modified B-17 seconds flew practice missions while British fighter aircraft simulated Luftwaffe attacks. Initially, these practice attacks came from shallow angles at moderate speeds. As gunners gained proficiency, the attacks became progressively more aggressive, eventually matching actual combat conditions. The practice aircraft used specialized cameras mounted at multiple positions, recording both the gunner's aim point and the attacking fighter simultaneously. This allowed precise measurement of lead angles and tracking accuracy. After each training flight, crews gathered for immediate debrief, while the experience remained fresh. Technical Sergeant Robert Harris, a waist gunner reassigned to the training detachment after his 25th mission, described the learning curve. First 5 practice missions I couldn't hit anything. Felt like I was shooting at the wrong point in space. 6th mission. Something clicked. I stopped thinking about where to aim and just let my body do it. Suddenly, I'm hitting targets consistently. Harris had identified the critical breakthrough point. Gunners couldn't consciously calculate lead angles during combat. The attacks happened too fast. Instead, they needed to develop instinctive aiming that incorporated the correct deflection automatically, what modern sports psychology would call unconscious competence. Achieving this required hundreds of practice engagements. Bowman's training program put gunners through 20 to 30 simulated attacks per training flight. Over a week of intensive training, each gunner experienced 150 to 200 practice engagements, far more than most would see in actual combat during a 25-mission tour. The training incorporated stress inoculation techniques, early practice runs allowed, gunners to concentrate solely on aiming. Later sessions added distractions, instructors shouting, aircraft maneuvering sharply, multiple simulated attacks from different angles simultaneously. The goal was making the correct aiming technique automatic, even under combat stress. By January 1944, the training detachment had processed its first class of 120 gunners drawn from replacement crews preparing for combat assignments. The results from practice exercises proved dramatic. Gunners who completed the week-long training program hit targets in 45 to 60% of practice engagements, compared to the 8% hit rate from actual combat data. The obvious question: would the training translate to actual combat effectiveness? The only way to find out was sending trained gunners into combat and analyzing results. The 8th Air Force faced a challenge here. Combat was chaotic, and confirmation of aerial victories notoriously difficult. Gunners often claimed hits that couldn't be verified. The solution was continuing the systematic data collection that had identified the problem originally. Gun cameras became mandatory equipment on all bombers beginning January 1944. Armament officers were required to analyze gun camera footage from every mission and file detailed reports documenting defensive engagements. Additional data would come from German sources. Intelligence analysts systematically reviewed Luftwaffe loss reports captured from occupied territories. When German records showed fighters lost on dates and locations matching American bomber missions, Analysts cross-referenced these losses with American combat reports and gun camera footage. The first trained gunners entered combat in January 1944 with the 457th Bomb Group, a new unit assigned to the 8th Air Force. Standard procedure was mixing experienced crews with replacement crews, but the 457th arrived as a complete unit, with all crews trained in the new gunnery techniques at Duxford before entering combat. This created an unintentional controlled experiment. The 457th would face the same German fighter opposition as other bomb groups, but with gunners trained in techniques other groups hadn't yet learned. Any difference in defensive effectiveness would be attributable to training rather than other factors. The group's first combat mission came on February 10, 1944. 24 B-17 seconds from the 457th participated in a raid on Brunswick. German fighters intercepted the formation over Holland. Combat reports documented 14 separate fighter attacks against 457th aircraft. Gun camera analysis after the mission showed something unprecedented. 8 of the 14 attacking fighters showed visible hits. 3 were assessed as probably destroyed based on observed damage. 2 more were listed as damaged. The group's gunners had achieved hit rates exceeding 50% in their first combat engagement. More remarkably, the 457th lost no aircraft to fighter attack during the mission. 1 bomber was damaged by flak and returned safely. German records later revealed that 2 Fw-190 seconds and 1 Bf-109 were lost during the engagement, precisely matching the 457th's claims for 3 probable victories. Over the next 4 weeks, the 457th flew 8 more combat missions. Analysis of gun camera footage from these missions documented a sustained hit rate of 48% against attacking fighters. German loss records showed 14 Luftwaffe fighters destroyed or damaged in engagements with the 457th during this period. The group's loss rate remained dramatically lower than the 8th Air Force average. While other groups were losing 4 to 6% of aircraft dispatched per mission to fighter attack, the 457th lost only 1.8%. Luftwaffe pilots began avoiding the 457th's formations when other targets were available. The evidence was undeniable. The training worked. By March 1944, the 8th Air Force had established permanent gunnery training detachments at 3 bases in England. All replacement gunners coming from the United States would spend 1 week in intensive deflection shooting training before joining combat units. Existing crews would rotate through refresher training during stand-down periods. Implementing the training program across the entire 8th Air Force took months. Different bomb groups received training at different times. This created opportunities for before and after comparison within individual groups. The 91st Bomb Group Captain Bowman's original unit provides a clear example. Before training implementation, the 91st's gunners averaged 9.2% confirmed hits against attacking fighters across missions, flown from September through December 1943. After training began in March 1944, the group's hit rate increased to 54% by May 1944, based on gun camera analysis and German loss records. The improvement carried strategic implications. German fighter units attacking bomber formations suffered dramatically increased casualties. Luftwaffe units that had routinely pressed attacks to point-blank range now broke away earlier. Fighter pilots who had survived dozens of missions against American bombers in 1943 were being shot down in early 1944. By summer 1944, Luftwaffe fighter commanders faced an impossible dilemma. If their fighters didn't attack American bomber formations, the bombers would destroy German industrial targets unopposed. But if fighters did attack, they faced defensive fire far more lethal than anything encountered in 1943. Loss rates among fighter units increased to unsustainable levels. The improved gunnery effectiveness combined with introduction of long-range P-51 Mustang escorts to create a collapse in German fighter effectiveness. By D-Day in June 1944, the Luftwaffe had largely withdrawn from daytime operations over Western Europe. American bombers operated with near impunity. The training revolution had succeeded beyond anyone's initial expectations. March 15th, 1944. Over. Berlin. The interrogation room at Stalag Luft 3 prisoner of war camp. Luftwaffe intelligence officer Hauptmann Klaus Richter sat across from a newly captured American B-17 tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Daniel Morrison. Morrison's bomber had been shot down during a raid on German aircraft factories near Berlin the previous day. Richter spoke excellent English, learned during a pre-war academic exchange at Princeton. His questioning wasn't harsh. Geneva Convention rules protected prisoners, but he probed for information about changes in American bomber tactics and equipment. "Your defensive fire has become noticeably more effective in recent months," Richter observed. "Our pilots report being hit far more frequently than they experienced last year. Have you received new weapons? Improved ammunition, perhaps?" Morrison, trained in prisoner of war protocol, gave only name, rank, and serial number. But Richter had interrogated dozens of American airmen. He could extract information from what prisoners wouldn't say as effectively as from what they would. He tried a different approach. "Our pilots have noticed that American gunners now seem to aim differently. They describe your tracer patterns as appearing to lag behind attacking aircraft, yet somehow bullets are hitting targets. This is puzzling. Would you care to explain the technique?" Morrison remained silent, but his slight reaction, a flicker of surprise that Richter had identified, the aiming method told the German officer what he needed to know. The Americans had developed new training, not new technology. That conclusion would reach Luftwaffe headquarters within days. German fighter commanders recognized immediately that American bomber gunners had solved the deflection problem that had kept defensive fire largely ineffective through 1943. The question facing Luftwaffe tacticians was how to counter this improvement. Several approaches were attempted. Some fighter units experimented with even higher speed, attack runs, diving from altitude to build closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. The theory was that at extreme closing speeds, even trained gunners couldn't compute sufficient lead angle. This proved partially successful, but created different problems. At such high speeds, attacking fighter pilots had mere fractions of a second to aim and fire before breaking away. Most attacks resulted in no hits on target. Those fighters that did score hits often sustained battle damage from improved bomber defensive fire. Other units tried attacking from unexpected angles. Instead of stern attacks that American gunners had trained extensively against, fighters approached from below, above, or directly head-on. These oblique approaches created complex deflection problems that might overwhelm even trained gunners. Gun camera analysis from American bombers showed this tactic was somewhat effective initially. Gunners trained primarily against stern attacks showed lower hit rates when engaging fighters from unusual angles. But American training quickly adapted, incorporating practice against multi-directional attacks. By May 1944, German fighter losses from bomber defensive fire had tripled compared to 1,943 rates. Experienced fighter pilots, the veterans who knew how to press attacks effectively, were being killed or wounded at rates the Luftwaffe couldn't sustain. Replacement pilots, with minimal training, fared even worse against improved American defensive gunnery. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, commanding officer of JG-77, a fighter wing that had fought against American bombers since 1943, later described the transition. In 1943, we could press attacks to 100 meters or less without excessive risk. The Americans would shoot, certainly, but hits were uncommon. By spring 1944, approaching within 200 meters meant very high probability of taking damage. Our loss rates became unsupportable. The improved American gunnery effectiveness had consequences extending beyond immediate combat results. German fighter tactics evolved toward defensive postures rather than aggressive attacks. Fighters would make high-speed passes but break away earlier. They'd engage bomber formations at longer ranges where defensive fire was less accurate. These defensive tactics reduced Luftwaffe losses but also reduced effectiveness against the bombers themselves. Fighters breaking away at 200 yards instead of pressing to 100 yards were less likely to inflict critical damage on their targets. More American bombers survived to reach their objectives. The strategic implications cascaded through German war production. American heavy bombers were systematically destroying German aircraft factories, oil refineries, and transportation networks. Every successful bombing raid weakened Germany's ability to defend against future raids. The improved defensive gunnery accelerated this downward spiral. But the story of deflection shooting training extended beyond the immediate bomber war over Europe. The principles and methods developed by Captain Bowman and his team at Duxford influenced American military training across multiple domains. In the Pacific theater, Navy gunners on ships faced similar challenges, engaging high-speed Japanese aircraft during kamikaze attacks. The same relative motion problems existed gunners on moving platforms, trying to hit fast-moving targets. Beginning in mid-1944, Navy anti-aircraft training incorporated lessons from the 8th Air Force deflection shooting program. The results mirrored the bomber experience. Navy gunners who received improved deflection training showed dramatically higher hit rates against Japanese aircraft. While this didn't eliminate the kamikaze threat, a damaged aircraft could still strike its target. It significantly reduced successful attacks. Ships with trained gun crews survived at much higher rates than ships with crews using pre-1944 training methods. Fighter pilots faced inverse problems. Instead of shooting from a moving platform at a fast-moving target, they were a fast-moving platform shooting at other fast-moving targets. The relative motion calculations became even more complex because both shooter and target maneuvered in 3 dimensions. American fighter pilot training had traditionally emphasized dogfighting, maneuvering to advantageous positions rather than precision deflection shooting. This worked against Japanese fighters that accepted close-range turning fights. It proved less effective against German fighters whose pilots often made high-speed slashing attacks. In late 1944, the Army Air Force's Fighter Gunnery School at Las Vegas began incorporating deflection shooting principles from the bomber gunnery program. Fighter pilots practiced high deflection shots against towed targets, learning to fire at points in empty space where target and bullets would converge. Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer, commanding officer of the 352nd Fighter Group and the 5th ranking American ace in Europe, described the training's impact. Before deflection training, I'd fire at fighters and see my rounds trail behind them. After training, I understood to aim at where they'd be, not where they were. My kill rate tripled. The computing gun sight, introduced on American fighters in late 1944, automated some deflection calculations. Pilots would track targets through the sight while maintaining constant range and angle. The sight computed required lead and displayed a pipper showing where to aim. This technology complemented training by reducing mental workload during combat. Post-war analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey examined factors contributing to Allied air superiority over Europe. The study identified 3 primary factors: introduction of long-range escort fighters, destruction of German aircraft production facilities, and improved bomber defensive gunnery. The survey estimated that improved defensive gunnery accounted for approximately 30% reduction in German fighter effectiveness during the first half of 1944. This was comparable to the impact of P-51 Mustang escorts and far exceeded the impact of any specific technological improvement in American aircraft. Perhaps more significantly, the deflection shooting training revolution changed military training philosophy fundamentally. Previously, gunnery training had focused on giving students time to practice shooting until they developed adequate skills. The assumption was that proficiency came primarily from repetition and experience. The deflection shooting program demonstrated that understanding principles mattered as much as repetition. Gunners who understood why the technique worked learned faster and performed better than those who simply practiced without comprehension. Modern training terminology would call this metacognition, understanding your own learning process. This insight influenced post-war military training across all branches. The concept that training should teach underlying principles rather than just procedures became foundational to modern military education. From flight training to infantry tactics to naval operations, American military training emphasized understanding the why behind the what. The deflection shooting methodology spread internationally as well. British and Commonwealth Air Forces studied American training techniques and incorporated similar programs. After the war, NATO standardized aerial gunnery training based largely on the Duxford model. Soviet Air Forces, analyzing captured German intelligence reports about American gunnery effectiveness, developed parallel training programs. While Soviet military doctrine differed significantly from American approaches in many areas, the physics of deflection shooting was universal. Soviet bomber and naval gunners received training remarkably similar to what American forces had developed. The influence extended into civilian aviation. Commercial airline pilots learned that understanding relative motion and rates of closure was essential for safe operations. Training programs for instrument flight incorporated principles originally developed for military gunnery, teaching pilots to understand their motion relative to other aircraft and to navigation points. In the emerging field of air traffic control, controllers learned to predict aircraft positions based on velocity vectors and rate of climb or descent. The mathematical frameworks were direct descendants of the ballistic calculations Dr. Morse had developed for bomber gunnery. Perhaps the most unexpected legacy appeared in early computer development. The need to calculate deflection angles rapidly and accurately had driven development of mechanical computing devices during the war. These analog computers, initially designed for anti-aircraft gunnery and bomber navigation, provided practical experience in automated calculation that informed post-war digital computer design. Engineers who'd worked on fire control computers during the war became pioneers in commercial computer development. Several explicitly cited the deflection shooting problem as inspiration for developing general-purpose computing solutions. The same mathematical operations needed for gunnery calculations had applications across numerous fields. By the 1950 seconds, the principles first articulated to help bomber gunners hit attacking fighters had diffused throughout American military training, influenced Allied forces worldwide, and contributed to developments in computing and aviation safety. Few wartime training innovations had such far-reaching impact. The original training detachment at Duxford closed in April 1945 as the war in Europe ended. Captain Bowman returned to the United States and resumed his pre-war career as a high school physics teacher in Michigan. He rarely discussed his wartime work, considering it simply applied physics rather than anything remarkable. Dr. Philip Morse returned to MIT and became a founding figure in operations research, applying mathematical analysis to military and industrial problems. His work analyzing bomber gunnery effectiveness became a standard case study in operations research courses, illustrating how systematic data collection and analysis could solve seemingly intractable problems. The gunners who'd learned deflection shooting techniques largely returned to civilian life after the war. Most never fully grasped how their training had represented a revolution in military effectiveness. They'd learned a technique that helped them survive. That the technique would influence military training for decades afterward wasn't something they'd considered. Yet that legacy persisted. Modern military training, whether for fighter pilots using computer-assisted gun sights or drone operators engaging targets through remote systems, still incorporates principles first articulated in that cold winter at Duxford airfield in 1943. Fundamental insight remains unchanged. Hitting moving targets from moving platforms requires understanding relative motion and training that builds unconscious competence. The story began with a crisis American bomber gunners achieving only 8% hit rates against attacking fighters, threatening to make the strategic bombing campaign unsustainable. It ended with a revolution-trained gunners achieving 60% hit rates, fundamentally shifting the balance of air combat over Europe. Between crisis and resolution stood systematic analysis, mathematical rigor, innovative training methods, and willingness to discard doctrine when evidence demanded change. Those elements, as much as the specific gunnery techniques, represented the true legacy of the deflection shooting revolution. The next time you see historical footage of B-17 seconds flying through German skies, look closely at those turrets and gun positions. The men operating those weapons weren't just shooting at attacking fighters. They were executing a carefully trained technique, developed through scientific analysis, that changed the course of the air war over Europe and influenced military training for generations afterward. They were aiming behind the target to hit where it would be, not where it appeared to be. And in doing so, they were demonstrating that even in the chaos of combat, systematic training based on sound principles could overcome seemingly impossible challenges.